This is a little article from the magazine Jungle World from Germany by someone named Tim Strosberg. It's titled Edward Said's Orientalism Thesis, Now Majority Opinion. Here's a little description of the article. It says, the first edition of Edward Said's major work, Orientalism, was published in November 1978. With his thesis, Said not only triggered a debate about the Western understanding of the Middle East that continues to have an impact today, but also provided key words for those who recently approved of Hamas's attack on Israel as a, quote, decolonial struggle, end quote. And here's the article. What do the ancient Greek poet Aeschylus, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger have in common? If you believe the literary scholar Edward Said, then they are all participants in a discourse about the, quote, Orient, in which it plays the role of cultural counterpart to Western culture. In his study of the same name, first published in 1978, Said referred to this discourse as Orientalism. In it, he explains that since ancient times, European poets, philosophers, and scientists have painted a picture of the Middle East that, on the one hand, hardly corresponds to the reality of the region, but on the other hand is useful for identity-forming projections and as a basis for legitimation of all kinds of Western claims to power. He further claims that Orientalism as a, quote, system of truths, end quote, became so established in the 19th century that virtually every statement made by every European about the Orient was, quote, racist, imperialist, and almost entirely ethnocentric, end quote. After the original English language edition was published 45 years ago, there was controversy about it. Among others, the American Oriental researcher and Islamic scholar Bernard Lewis, as well as Arab intellectuals such as the Syrian philosopher Sadiq al-Azam, spoke out against Said's book. His critics accused Said, among other things, of selectively selecting for his analysis only those contributions from the over 60,000 works on the Middle East published in Europe and the United States that supported his Orientalism thesis. The fact that Western science and culture has undoubtedly also produced racist and imperialist contributions is far from enough to make a thesis as general as his. The representations of the Middle East and Islam in the West were significantly more diverse than Said claimed. Many Jewish scientists, for example, looked at Islam with admiration. Critics also spoke out who suspected Said's political agenda behind Orientalism. And in fact, Said noted in the afterword to the new edition published in 1994 that he had not written a, quote, theory machine, end quote, but rather a primarily, quote, partisan book, end quote. Said wrote Orientalism under the impression of the Six-Day War of 1967 and the reactions of U.S. politicians and the public to it. After the victory of the Israeli side and its resulting control over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, Said developed from a literary scholar to a political activist and advocate for Palestinian nationalism. quote, Orientalism, end quote, was now intended to uncover the West's always existing projective needs and claims to power in relation to the Middle East, and together with the follow-up publications, The Question of Palestine in 1979 and Covering Islam in 1981, to provide an alternative positive image of the West Palestinians and Islam. Sorry, this is like a translation, so some of the sentences might be a little sketchy. Orientalism became an international bestseller and is now considered a canonical work of literature, humanities, and social sciences. The term Orientalism is now part of the standard vocabulary of supposedly, quote, critical thinking, end quote. Said also made a decisive contribution to the founding of post-colonial studies. Signal words like, quote, occupation or, quote, narrative can already be found in Orientalism. Said owes his success not least to the, quote, sorry about that. Said owes his success not least to the, quote, cultural turn, end quote, that took place in Western universities from the early 1970s. Said's contribution proved to be groundbreaking in this regard. Instead of the previously mostly Marxist-influenced theories of anti-colonialism, Said put a cultural explanation of Western imperialism. Said gave a cultural explanation of Western imperialism and colonialism. Karl Marx himself ultimately fell victim to this. Said assumes that Marx was an Orientalist and gets rid of the older criticism of imperialism. Many followed him in this. Simultaneously, with the, quote, cultural turn, end quote, a debate about the supposedly Eurocentric curricula and canon took place at English-speaking universities, which continues to this day, as a result of which non-Western authors experienced a rise in importance. Here, too, Orientalism proved to be groundbreaking. From the supposedly authentic perspective of an Arab Christian Palestinian, Said presented his Western audience with a narrative of the eternal oppression of Islam by the West. Said was not only popular at Western universities. In the above-mentioned afterword, from 1994, Said felt compelled to write against the appropriation of his book by Islamist forces who saw it as a defense of Islam. However, a closer look at his book shows that his Orientalism thesis actually offers starting points for well-known Islamist arguments. The fact that Western research on Islam and the Orient fundamentally misrepresents Islam, as Said claims, has been spread by Islamists since the 1930s as part of the conspiracy theory of a, quote, Jewish Western war against Islam, end quote. The Marxist Syrian philosopher Sadiq al-Azam, that's AL-AZM, therefore accused Said that his book was leading left-wing Arab activists to Islamism. In addition to Islam, it was primarily the Palestinians that Said tried to romanticize with Orientalism and the question of Palestine. He declared them victims of Zionism and the West. For this purpose, Said ammunitioned his text with crude assertions. In his even sharper and more direct book, The Question of Palestine, he suggests that, quote, Zionist interest groups, end quote, in the West would ensure that any criticism of Zionism would be considered anti-Semitic. Consequently, there is a taboo on talking about what the, quote, Jews did to their victims in the age of the genocidal extermination of the Jews, end quote. Said's main thesis is that Zionism is historically and practically linked to European imperialism. To do this, he uses various alleged statements by Zionist thinkers such as Theodor Herzl, which are intended to prove that they shared the same Orientalist view of the Middle East as the European imperialists. As before in his thesis on Western Oriental studies, Said goes overboard in his generalization of the Zionist movement. With Martin Buber, who is not mentioned in Said, there was an important protagonist of Zionism who represented a positive view of the Middle East that was extremely contrary to European Orientalism, and even spoke of a spiritual and intellectual closeness of Judaism to the Arab world. Said states in the question of Palestine that the quote Zionist wanted to advance the quote colonization of Palestine end quote and cleanse the country of its Arab inhabitants. Such a distortion of history completely ignores European anti-Semitism and the Shoah, which led to the founding of Israel. Said's claims ultimately culminate in the thesis that Zionism united European Jews with, quote, white Europeans, end quote. For Said, hostility towards Jews is not just a thing of history. It is even more the Arabs who, as, quote, Semites, are affected by anti-Semitism today. Said's understanding of anti-Semitism is therefore based on the fallacy that it represents hostility against, quote, Semites, end quote, per se. Said concludes that the Jews who fled Europe and were, quote, once victims themselves, end quote, have become the, quote, oppressors, end quote, of the Palestinian Arabs. Said thus anticipated in his book what is now the majority opinion within post-colonial studies. When the Arab-Israeli conflict is referred to, Jews are seen as, quote, white by permission, end quote, Abigail Bakan, or simply as new Nazis, who in Gaza are nothing else operated as the, quote, equivalent continuation of the Warsaw Ghetto, end quote. Ramon Grossfugel. Current demands for the, quote, decolonization of Palestine, end quote, and the associated reinterpretation of anti-Semitic Palestinian terrorism as a, quote, act of resistance, end quote, continue Said's ideas. They are also proof that the path from post-colonialism seminars to calling for the murder of Jews has become shorter.